Lecture 1. We're going to get into some of the history of the recording industry today. So let's get started. So, when we're talking about the history of the recording industry, we're going to start at the very beginning, when we could first have the technology to record sound. That's where the industry really started. So, in 1877, the recording industry starts with the creation of the phonograph. Now, when you think 1877, there is not transistors yet. There is not technology for us to record electronically. So, this is going to be a very crude form of sound recording, but it is sound recording nonetheless. So, Thomas Edison developed the phonograph. Although French inventor Charles Cros designed but did not build the first sound recording device a little bit earlier than 1877. So, we have two different things going on there, and there may be several other inventors or engineers that have had the idea of recording sound and came up with a way to do it, but Edison was just the first one to develop it. Charles Cros is credited with being the first person to come up with a design for a recording device. And that is not to say that Thomas Edison himself invented the phonograph. Thomas Edison was more of a company. He would hire scientists. He would hire inventors to come up with inventions, and if they did, he would claim them for himself because it was work for hire. Now, that's not to say he didn't invent some things, but when it comes to actually inventing the phonograph, it was more than likely a work for hire situation in Thomas Edison's company, which he still gets credit for. One technical part of these early phonographs are they were recorded on wax cylinders, and they were intended for voice recordings, not music. So when they first made these recording devices, they were thinking of it being to record speeches and to record readings of a book, things like that, to get news out, not to record music. That wasn't their intention at the beginning. So, just like I touched on, there were many adjacent possible inventors and inventions at this time. So what that means is an adjacent possible means that while Thomas Edison was developing the phonograph, the French inventor Charles Cros was also over here having designed the first sound recording device a little bit earlier, and they may not have even known about each other. That's what an adjacent possible is. They're adjacent ideas coming to fruition. All right, so on the left is a patent design for the phonograph, the first kind of phonographs. You can see this is the needle playing on the wax cylinder. You have this is a speaker, and this is the attachment that goes on to it. Sorry. And then you have a handle. This is going to be obviously hand cranked, and so you can wonder how that would affect the music. Obviously, if you go faster, it's going to be a quicker tempo. If you go slower, it's going to be slower. But here's a picture of an old phonograph. Obviously, sound comes out of here. Now, these weren't terribly loud. It's hand cranked, no electronic machinery in it at all. It wasn't terribly loud, and the recordings weren't terribly good, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So, let's talk about the first recording companies. As an industry, we have the recording device, we have the phonograph, the playback device. Now, what were the first companies to offer these to people for sale? Because it's about making money in the end, isn't it? Well, Edison Records formed in 1888. Now, you'll notice that's quite a bit of time from when the phonograph was invented. So, although the phonograph was invented, what did we say? 1877? Took 11 years for Edison Records to be founded. So, around the same time, Columbia Phonograph Company starts, 1889. Okay. Then Victor Talking Machine Company in 1901. All right, so this is within within about a 3-year span. 3-4 years, depending on the exact dates. We're seeing 3 major record labels form, and in some way or fashion, some form or fashion, 2 of them are around even to today. So you're seeing some major players being formed right at the beginning. So now no other labels could get, a major traction in the market until the original patents expired around 1920. Okay. So then comes a development. The phonograph goes from being a wax cylinder to being a disc. All right, so the invention of the flat disc is in the 1880s. So we go from wax cylinder to flat disc. This is by German-born Emil Berliner. We get flat discs, and then he founded a company that later became Victor Talking Machine Company. Victor Talking Machine Company. Okay. So, let's talk about the smaller labels that began to form. This is going to be after around 1920, when the original patents on this tech ran out. So smaller labels start to form, and then we're going to see the collapse of the music industry as we know it at that time. So again, we're talking starting here in the 1920s when the smaller labels form. So 1920 through early 1930s, a large amount of smaller labels succeeded. All right. Now, when you get to the 1930s, multiple factors contribute to the decline of the record industry. So, what factors contributed to it? Now, you still had, the Victor Talking Machine Company, you still had Columbia, you still had Edison, but then a bunch of other labels came to prominence during the 1920s to 30s. Because they saw a need for it, a space in the market. People were buying these records, so they took advantage. Now, in the 1930s, multiple factors contributed to the decline of the record industry. So it was very big in the 1930s. Now, what happened? Well, radio became popular, was one thing. We see the introduction of the radio. So if you have to buy a phonograph here on your left versus buying a radio here on your right at that time. A lot of people, even if you like both, you may not have exponential money. A lot of people opted for the radio. Okay, why? Well, it offered free music. You didn't have to buy discs. You could get it for free after your initial investment into the radio. What's another factor? The Great Depression. People didn't have enough money to buy records anymore, or at least not as much. Okay, so those two factors, the rise of the radio and the Great Depression, lead to Edison records shutting down in 1929. So they're active from 1988 to 1929, and then they have to shut down. Victor merged with RCA, a radio maker at the time. So Victor Talking Machine Company merges with RCA. They formed the RCA Victor Company in 1929. Columbia changes owners multiple times before being bought by CBS, Radio Broadcasting Company at the time. Now, CBS would continue to buy up different music industry companies over time. One of the most famous being Fender Instruments. They bought Fender. CBS bought Fender in the 60s. So we'll see the radio companies having a lot of the money and the market share. So Columbia is not independent anymore. It's owned by CBS. Victor merged with RCA. It's now RCA Victor, and Edison just went and shut down. Okay, I'm going to post a link to record manufacturing in this era. So I want you to watch that video after this lecture, and the link will be in this assignment. All right, let's talk about the decline of the phonograph. So, standard recording disc of this era was played back at 78 revolutions per minute. Okay? They were referred to as 78s. So, once we went from wax cylinders to discs, those discs are called 78s. These discs were heavy, but they were not durable. Early recordings were made through large horns. Okay? So not through microphones, through horns. They were very noisy and hard to hear. And then, when electric microphones got introduced in the 20s, it did help a bit. The quality got a little bit better. But also radio was introduced in the 1920s. So radio offered superior sound quality over what was available at the time. So your quality on 78s was not as good as what your quality on radio was. So that initial investment into the radio yielded limitless music. You did not have to buy records. Then by the 1930s, many radio stations featured live music performed by combos or orchestras. Now, that's kind of significant because if it is a live event broadcasted through the radio, that's the only place you can hear it. And if people have, or radio stations have become known for those live music performances, people are going to tune in, right? So all these reasons, radio became more popular than the phonograph. So phonograph records just could not compete. Here's a picture of what a 78 looks like. Not too dissimilar from a the other types of records that came later. Okay, so let's talk about some of those records. The LP, the long play, and the single. Let's talk about them. So, after World War II, a new record format led to a rebirth of the music industry. Columbia pioneered the long play disc that played back at 33 and 1/3 RPM, revolutions per minute. So it was offered more playing time and better fidelity than the earlier 78s. So LPs, you could put more music on them, and it was a better product. So those are 33s. So you'll see, you may have heard the term if you're into any kind of record collecting, LPs versus singles, or 33s versus 45s. A lot of times singles are referred to as 45s. So let's talk about those. RCA Victor, that merged company, saw the LP, saw that it was doing good, and said, okay, we're going to come out with the 45 RPM single. So this was more economical to produce than the 78s. Also, it was more economical to produce than the LPs as well. And then they were more durable than 78s. So in these days, LPs became the preferred format for adult listeners who can enjoy longer works such as Broadway musicals or symphonies. And then the 45 was pitched at the youth market. What they didn't know when it was invented was it was going to become the medium for a new musical style, rock and roll. Okay, let's look at size comparisons. So this is an LP, the 33.5 or 1/3 RPM. This is the old 78s, and these are the singles, 45s. This is a CD for comparison. Okay. So also they go by size, meaning 12-inch, 10-inch, and 7-inch. 12-inch LPs are typically played at 33 RPM, right? But there is something called an extended play, an EP, that would play at 45 RPM if it's on a 12-inch. So those are a little bit shorter than the LPs. And they hold about 22 minutes of music per side, the LPs do. 10-inch were the 78s. By comparison, they only held 3 minutes of music per side. So the old 78s only held 3 minutes of music per side. The LPs hold 22 minutes. And even the 45s, the singles, hold more than the old 78s. So they're played at 45 RPM. They hold around 5 minutes of music per side. So you could fit a song or two, depending on how long a song is, per side of a single. Usually one song, that's why it's called a single. But, people typically did A side and B side of the single. So you'd have the single on the A side, and then the B side would have one or two short songs or a song. All right, that is it for lecture 1